They waited until my parents were buried before they told me the house was never mine. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I just stood there, holding the same keys I had used for 20 years, and listened as my own blood explained how little I mattered. I had washed those floors when everyone else was busy living their lives. I had fed 2 aging bodies when no one else even called. I had carried weak frames to the bathroom at midnight, cleaned vomit, changed sheets, and whispered comfort when pain made them cry. And still, they looked at me like a stranger standing in the wrong place. That was the moment I understood something important. Not everyone who shares your blood shares your heart. They spoke politely. Calm voices. Soft smiles. Like this was business, not betrayal. Like I was some tenant whose lease had expired, not the man who had given away 20 years of his life. I remember the way the light came through the window. Same light I had watched every morning while making breakfast for 2 people who could barely hold a spoon. Same light that fell on their chairs, now empty. And in that light, my own siblings told me I had 30 days to leave. No anger in their voices. No shame in their eyes. Just certainty. That hurt more than shouting ever could. I nodded. I even thanked them. Because some wars are not won with noise. They think I was weak that day. They still do. They don't know that was the day I started thinking. I moved into that house when I was young. Not rich. Not powerful. Just available. That's what they needed. Someone available. Someone who could pause his life without complaint. They said it would be temporary. Just until things got better. Just until the doctors fixed things. Just until arrangements were made. Temporary lasted 20 years. I watched my friends build careers. I watched relationships end because I could never commit. I watched life move forward from the same window every day, while mine stayed parked in the driveway. I didn't complain. I didn't count favors. I didn't keep score, because they were my parents. And I was raised to stand when others sit. At first, the siblings visited. Holidays, birthdays, short stays, long excuses. Then slowly, those visits became calls. And those calls became silence. It didn't happen suddenly. It never does. People don't abandon you in one step. They step back slowly so you don't notice. And I didn't notice. Because I was busy. Busy with medications. Busy with appointments. Busy with feeding schedules. Busy with late nights and early mornings. Busy holding hands during bad news. Busy pretending I was fine. I became the background of my own family. They would post photos. Vacations. Smiles. New cars. New homes. Promotions. Babies. Dinners. Celebrations. And I would like the picture. Then go back to changing sheets. No bitterness. Not then. Because love makes you stupid sometimes. I told myself, they're busy. They have their own lives. I told myself, they trust me. That's why they're not here. I told myself a lot of lies. But I believed them. The house became my whole world. Not in ownership. In responsibility. Every corner held memory. Every sound meant something. Every night had a routine. When the pain was bad, I sat on the floor and held shaking hands. When breathing was hard, I stayed awake listening to every rise and fall. When fear came, I became the calm voice. I wasn't a hero. I was just present. And presence, I learned, is rare. They didn't see the nights. They didn't hear the crying. They didn't smell the sickness. They didn't feel the weight. They just knew there was someone handling it. So they could forget. And forgetting is easy when someone else remembers for you. The years did something to me. They slowed me, softened me, made me quiet, made me careful, made me patient. I learned to speak less, listen more, wait longer. I learned that people reveal themselves when they think you're not watching. I saw it in small things. Delayed replies, short conversations, polite distance, empty promises. Still, I didn't prepare for what came next. When the first one passed, the house went silent in a way I can't explain. Not quiet, empty. Like a sound had been removed from the world. The second followed not long after. And suddenly, the house that had been full of need became full of memory. That's when they returned. Not with tears. Not with guilt. With folders. With papers. With plans. They walked through rooms like buyers, not children. They talked about value. About selling. About division. They didn't ask me how I was. They didn't ask how I was sleeping. They didn't ask if I was okay. They asked about the will. That was the first cut. Not deep, but sharp. I answered calmly. Because that's who I had become. They smiled. Because they thought that meant agreement. They were wrong. They started coming more often. Measuring. Discussing. Whispering. Closing doors. I stayed in the kitchen. Making tea. Like always. Invisible people see everything. I heard the tone change. The respect disappear. The assumptions grow. They spoke about the house as if I was furniture. And then, one afternoon, they sat me down. Not together. Never together. One at a time. That's how cowards work. First came sympathy. Then logic. Then firmness. And finally, the sentence that ended everything. You should start looking for somewhere else. Not now. Not immediately. But soon. Because it was time. Time. As if my time had not already been spent. I looked at the wall behind them. The same wall I had leaned against when exhaustion made me dizzy. The same wall that had heard my prayers. And I smiled. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is stay calm. They took that as weakness. They always do. They don't understand the quiet man is usually thinking the most. I packed nothing that night. I just sat in my room and listened to the house. The pipes. The floor. The old familiar sounds. I wasn't sad. I was alert. Because when people show you who they are, believe them. And when they think you are finished, that's when you begin. They didn't wait for grief to settle before they started dividing. Not dividing memories. Not dividing responsibility. Dividing property. I watched from the hallway as they opened drawers that had not been opened in years. I watched hands touch things that had only known mine. I watched eyes scan walls like strangers in a museum. And I understood something quietly. They were already gone long before they left. They spoke in careful tones, the way people do when they don't want to sound cruel. As if soft words could make hard intentions gentle. They said it was practical. They said it was fair. They said it was what would have been wanted. They always say that. People use the dead as shields. No one asked me what I wanted. No one asked me what I had given. They assumed. Because when you give without noise, people assume you have nothing to lose. They walked through the bedroom and pointed at furniture. Not with fingers. With eyes. Quiet agreements passing between them. I stood near the door, leaning against the frame, watching. Not interrupting. Not reacting. They didn't even notice me. That was when it truly settled in. I was no longer family. I was an obstacle. And obstacles are removed. One of them cleared their throat and said it again, more directly this time. That I should make plans. That it would be better for everyone. That change is part of life. They smiled while saying it. I nodded. Not because I agreed. Because I was listening. There is a difference. I had learned that over years of sitting beside hospital beds. You listen to tone. To pauses. To what is not said. And what was not said was loud. They did not say thank you. They did not say we appreciate you. They did not say we owe you. They said, it's time. As if I was some outdated appliance. That night, I walked through every room. Slowly. without turning on many lights, letting the dark show me what mattered. The chair where hands had rested, the table where medicine had been counted, the corner where I had slept on the floor when breathing became too shallow to leave the room. Every mark on the wall had a story. Every creak had a memory. This house had seen me tired, scared, weak, and determined. And now, it was being taken by people who had only seen it as an asset. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't hurt. Because I was finished being surprised. I made tea. Sat at the same spot. Looked at the same window. And I thought, people think revenge is loud, angry, fast. It isn't. Real revenge is patient. It waits. I remembered all the conversations, all the promises, all the messages that had gone unanswered, all the visits that never happened. I remembered who had shown up, and who hadn't, and I let that memory settle like dust. The next morning, they came again, with more energy, more confidence, like they already owned everything. One of them opened a cupboard and asked where something was, as if I was still the help. I told them, calmly. They thanked me, briefly, and kept going. I noticed something then, a pattern. They weren't just planning. They were counting, measuring, checking, verifying. They were in a hurry. Hurry always means fear, and fear always means weakness. I watched. I listened. I learned. I learned who wanted what, who pushed, who followed, who pretended to care, who didn't bother pretending. It was like watching a play where I already knew the ending. They talked about legal things, about paperwork, about rights. They used words they didn't fully understand. That's always dangerous, because confidence without knowledge is loud. I kept quiet. Silence is useful. One of them asked if I had copies of documents. I said I would look. They nodded, satisfied. They thought I was still the same. The helpful one. The reliable one. The convenient one. They didn't know I had been handling everything for 2 decades. They didn't know I had signed things, read things, filed things. They didn't know I knew where things were. They didn't know I knew what things meant, because they never asked. People assume the quiet man knows nothing. That is their mistake. The days passed like this. They came. They measured. They planned. They hinted. They pushed. I smiled. I agreed. I delayed. I said, soon. I said, I'll check. I said, I'll see. And they heard, yes. But I was saying, wait. There is power in delay. I started sorting. Not packing. Sorting. Not things. Information. I pulled old files. Old letters. Old records. Old receipts. I read everything. Slowly. Carefully. Not with anger. With interest. Because truth leaves traces. And I had time. They thought I was losing. I was learning. One evening, one of them sat across from me and spoke in a softer voice, like they were doing me a favor. They said I had done a good thing. They said I should be proud. They said it was time to think about myself. Then they said the part they had rehearsed, that I couldn't stay. They watched my face closely, waiting for emotion, waiting for resistance. I gave them nothing, just a nod. That made them relax. People relax when they think they've won. They leaned back, smiled, talked about the future. Not mine, theirs. I listened, because the more people talk, the more they reveal. And they revealed plenty. They talked about selling, about dividing money, about upgrades, about plans. They spoke as if I wasn't there, and that was fine, because I was very much there. I was noticing everything. The way they avoided certain topics, the way they looked at each other, the way they hesitated on certain words. Guilt makes people clumsy. They didn't hide it well. I realized something then. They weren't just pushing me out. They were afraid of something. I didn't know what yet. But fear always has a reason. And reasons leave trails. That night, I went to bed with a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. Not peace. Clarity. There is a difference. Peace comes after. Clarity comes before. I wasn't thinking about leaving. I was thinking about staying. Not in the house. In the game. Because if you have given someone 20 years of your life, you deserve more than 30 days to disappear. And I was not going to disappear. Not quietly. Not completely. Not without balance. They thought I was preparing to leave. I was preparing to remember. Every drawer I opened, every box I lifted, every paper I touched, I did it slowly. Not with urgency. With intention. People in a hurry make mistakes. People who are calm collect evidence. I had learned that in hospitals. In offices. In life. They had no idea how much passed through my hands over the years. Bills. Statements. Forms. Letters. Legal papers. Medical files. Property records. When you are the caregiver, you become the gatekeeper. And they had never asked what that meant. They assumed caregiving was just feeding and cleaning. They never thought about responsibility. I had signed for deliveries. Signed for services. Signed for repairs. Signed for home modifications. Signed for insurance. Signed for maintenance. I had talked to lawyers, doctors, banks, agencies. Not once had anyone else come with me. Not once. They were always busy. So I handled it. And now, they were acting like visitors in a house built on my effort. The irony was quiet, but sharp. I opened an old folder one afternoon and found something I had forgotten. A document from years ago. Something signed during a difficult time. When decisions had to be made quickly. I read it once. Then again. And I felt a small shift inside. Not excitement. Not anger. Focus. Because this was not nothing. This was leverage. I didn't smile. I didn't react. I placed it back carefully. Because knowledge is power only when hidden. I kept reading. More letters. More notes. More details. I began to see patterns. I began to see gaps. And I began to see something they clearly had not. They thought the house was simple. Clean. Straightforward. It wasn't. Life rarely is. That evening, they came again. Louder. More confident. Talking openly now. Like the decision was already made. One of them mentioned a date. A timeline. Another nodded. They were planning without me. Which told me everything. They were not negotiating. They were informing. I listened. Quiet. Because when people stop negotiating, they start exposing. They talked about movers. About storage. About helping me find somewhere. As if I was a problem to be solved. I thanked them. They looked relieved. Relief is dangerous. Because relief means guards are down. After they left, I didn't move for a long time. I sat at the table and stared at the surface. The same scratches. The same marks. The same space where pills had been sorted. I placed my hand there. And I made a decision. Not a dramatic one. A precise one. I would not fight them. I would not beg. I would not explain. I would let them continue. Because people reveal more when they think they are in control. The next few days, I became even quieter. I agreed to everything. Yes. Sure. Of course. No problem. They loved that. They started treating the house like it was already theirs. Walking freely. Opening things without asking. Speaking loudly. They brought someone once. A stranger. Showed them around. Didn't introduce me. That told me where I stood. Invisible again. And that was perfect. Because invisible men see everything. I heard them discussing numbers. Amounts. Shares. I heard frustration when something didn't line up. I heard impatience when someone questioned a detail. I heard fear when something didn't make sense. And I filed it away. That night, I went back to the files. Pulled out what I needed. Made copies. Put things back exactly where they were. Order matters. People notice disorder. They didn't notice anything. Because they weren't looking for me. They were looking past me. The following day, one of them tried to be kind. Brought food. Asked if I was okay. Used my name. That was new. Kindness at the wrong time is not kindness. It's insurance. I thanked them. They smiled. But their eyes didn't match. They asked if I had started packing. I said not yet. They hesitated. Just a second. Then said it was fine. No rush. But their voice was tight. Pressure always leaks. I realized then they were on a schedule. And schedules mean commitments. Commitments mean promises. Promises mean lies. Because no one had promised me anything. I was no longer hurt. I was curious. I wanted to know how far they would go. How cold they could be. How quickly they could forget. So I waited. And they didn't disappoint. They started discussing things in front of me. As if I was already gone. Talking about changes. Renovations. New furniture. New colors. They spoke of the house like a blank space. As if it had not been filled with care and sacrifice. As if it had not been held together by my hands. I kept making tea. I kept washing dishes. I kept nodding. And I kept listening. Because listening costs nothing. And pays everything. One evening, one of them said something careless. A detail that didn't fit. They corrected themselves quickly. But not quickly enough. I caught it. And I smiled. Not outside. Inside. Because the picture was forming. They were not just dividing. They were hiding. Hiding something. And that is always interesting. The more I looked, the more I saw. Small things. Missing things. Changed things. Not mistakes. Choices. They had been making decisions for a long time. Without me. That was fine. Because now, I was making mine. I didn't sleep much that night. Not from worry. From clarity. I had given 20 years to people who could forget me in 30 days. That was not an accident. That was a lesson. And I was finally ready to learn it. I stood in the doorway of my room and looked around. The same walls. The same quiet. I wasn't angry. I was awake. Because when people push you out of your place, they don't realize they are pushing you into your power. And power does not announce itself. It waits. They started acting like I was already gone. Not openly. Not directly. In small ways. Subtle ways. The way people do when they don't want to feel guilty. They would come in and not greet me. Walk past without looking. Speak over me. Around me. I became background noise in my own home. And I let them. Because pride blinds people. And blind people walk into traps. I had lived in that house long enough to know every sound. Every shift in the floor. Every door that didn't close right. So when something changed, I noticed. They were moving things. Quietly. Carefully. Like thieves in daylight. Not stealing. Repositioning. Preparing. I watched a chair disappear one day. Then a lamp. Then a box from the storage room. I didn't ask. Asking would have warned them. Instead, I counted. People forget that caregivers are observers by nature. You learn to notice breathing. Swallowing. Movement. Change. I noticed everything. They began to talk about legal stuff more. Always in vague terms. Always cutting off when I came close. They thought I didn't hear. They were wrong. Walls don't block sound. Arrogance blocks awareness. I would be in the kitchen, washing a cup, and hear whispers in the next room. Quick voices. Sharp tones. A name mentioned. Then silence. They froze when they saw me. Smiled. Too late. I had already heard. They started leaving documents on the table. Carelessly. As if I wouldn't read them. I read them. Not all. Just enough. They didn't understand the words. They didn't understand the weight of what they were handling. They thought paperwork was just paper. They didn't know paper can change lives. I had seen that before. I started piecing things together. Slowly. Without urgency. They were pushing me out, yes. But they were also trying to move fast. Fast means pressure. Pressure means something is coming. People don't rush unless they are afraid of being caught. I began to think about the past. Not emotionally. Strategically. When had things changed? When had visits stopped? When had calls slowed? When had interest faded? There was a pattern. There is always a pattern. They had not drifted away. They had planned away. That thought sat heavy. Not painful. Heavy. Like a truth waiting to be lifted. I remembered a conversation from years ago. A quick one. A careless one. When someone had said something about the house that didn't make sense at the time. I had ignored it. Because I trusted. Trust is expensive. I realized something else then. They didn't just forget me. They used me. And that is worse. Because forgetting is careless. Using is deliberate. I kept my routine. Made breakfast. Cleaned. Organized. The same. Because consistency makes people careless. They stopped watching me. They thought I was defeated. That is the most dangerous mistake you can make. They brought more people. Lawyers. Advisors. Friends. Maybe. I don't know who they were. They never introduced me. They just walked in and spoke as if I was not there. I stood in the doorway once while they discussed options. One of them gestured in my direction and said something low. The others nodded. And they continued. I felt nothing. Not anger. Not shock. Just confirmation. That night, I went back to the files. I dug deeper. Not randomly. With purpose. Because now I knew there was something. And I found it. Not all at once. Piece by piece. A signature. A date. A clause. And suddenly, the story changed. The house was not as simple as they thought. The ownership was not as clean as they believed. And their confidence made sense. They were rushing because they were exposed. They just didn't know it yet. I sat there for a long time, holding a paper that could shift everything. Not smiling. Not celebrating. Just breathing. Because power should be held calmly. I placed it back. Carefully. Because surprises are more effective when they are sudden. The next morning, one of them asked me if I had spoken to anyone. Anyone. I said no. They looked relieved. That told me everything. People don't ask that unless they're worried. They asked about documents. About folders. About files. I said everything was where it always was. They nodded. And relaxed. They were not checking. They were testing. And I passed. Which meant they were comfortable again. Good. Comfort makes people lazy. Lazy people make mistakes. I continued to play my role. Quiet. Cooperative. Small. They grew louder. More demanding. One of them told me I should start clearing my room. Not suggested. Told. I nodded. They smiled. Because they like control. Control is intoxicating. It makes people sloppy. I started packing a little. Slowly. Enough to be seen. Not enough to be real. They saw boxes. They relaxed. They thought the end was near. They didn't realize the end was not for me. It was for them. I overheard an argument one evening. Raised voices. Sharp words. Something about timing. Something about risk. Then silence. When I walked in, they stopped. Smiled. Too quickly. People who are hiding always smile too quickly. They offered me a drink. Asked if I was okay. I said yes. They nodded. But their eyes were restless. Good. Restless eyes mean worry. Worry means pressure. Pressure means cracks. And cracks let light in. I was no longer guessing. I was confirming. They had done something. Something they didn't want me to know. Something connected to the house. And they needed me gone before it came out. I had spent 20 years taking care of people. Now I was watching people. And the care was gone. Replaced by clarity. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like an observer. And observers are dangerous. Because they are not emotional. They are accurate. I sat on the edge of my bed that night and thought about the years. The nights. The sacrifices. I didn't regret them. But I also didn't excuse what was happening. Two things can be true at once. I gave. They took. Now, I was going to balance the scale. Not loudly. Not angrily. Correctly. They stopped pretending after that. Not completely. Just enough. The politeness thinned. The patience shortened. The smiles came and went faster. They were running out of time. And they were not handling it well. I could feel it in the air. Tension doesn't hide. It just waits to be noticed. They began correcting me. Small things. Where I put cups. How I folded things. When I should eat. As if I was already a guest. Control always shows itself in small ways first. I let it happen. Because people who feel in control reveal more. One afternoon, I heard a phone call. A hushed one. In the hallway. My name mentioned. Not kindly. Then silence when they noticed me. I didn't react. I walked past. As if I hadn't heard. Because if you want to know what someone is doing, let them believe you don't know. That evening, they argued again. Louder this time. Something about documents not matching. Something about it should be simple. Something about he won't notice. That last part was almost a whisper. But I heard it. And I smiled inside. Because they were wrong. I had noticed everything. I went back to the files that night. Not nervously. Calmly. I wasn't searching anymore. I was verifying. And every verification strengthened the picture. They had made changes. Without telling me. Without asking. Without permission. They assumed I was just the caregiver. They forgot I was also the witness. I had been present when things were signed. When decisions were made. When words were spoken. They forgot that. People forget the quiet man. They shouldn't. I found another piece. Small. Almost meaningless to anyone else. But it fit. And when pieces fit, they form truth. I closed the folder and leaned back. No rush. No panic. Just certainty. The next day, one of them came early. Too early. People don't come early unless they are anxious. They went straight to the cabinet. Opened it. Checked something. Closed it. Then acted normal. I was in the kitchen. They didn't see me. Or they thought I didn't see them. Either way, I saw. They were checking. Which meant they were afraid. Good. Fear makes people predictable. They started speaking to me differently. Shorter. Sharper. Less patient. The kindness was gone. That told me the mask was slipping. When masks slip, truth shows. One of them told me I had to be out sooner than planned. Not asked. Told. I nodded. Because I wanted them confident. Confidence leads to mistakes. They asked if I had talked to anyone again. More insistently this time. I said no. They stared at me. Too long. I met their eyes. Calmly. They looked away. People who avoid eye contact are hiding something. I was done wondering. I was ready. But not yet. Timing matters. They began to pack things themselves. Removing items. Labeling boxes. Moving furniture. They were dismantling my life in front of me. And I let them. Because sometimes the best revenge is letting people believe they are winning. One evening, I overheard something that made everything clear. A name. A place. A mistake. They didn't know I was there. They didn't know I was listening. And in that moment, I understood the full shape of what they had done. It wasn't just selfish. It was dishonest. They had made a move years ago. Quietly. Without telling me. They had adjusted things. Rearranged things. Shifted things. And they had counted on my silence. On my loyalty. On my distraction. They had counted on me being busy. They were right. I had been busy. Busy caring. Busy giving. Busy sacrificing. And while I was doing that, they were planning. That realization did not hurt. It hardened. Because betrayal always does. Not immediately. Eventually. I walked into the room after that. Normal. As if nothing had happened. They froze. Then smiled. Too fast. Too wide. I smiled back. Not because I was friendly. Because I was finished pretending. They asked if everything was okay. I said yes. They nodded. But their shoulders were tight. Their voices thin. They knew something had changed. They just didn't know what. I let them feel that. Uncertainty is uncomfortable. And uncomfortable people make errors. That night, I packed one box. Just one. Not to leave. To show. They saw it the next morning. They relaxed. That told me everything. They thought progress meant surrender. They didn't understand patience. They didn't understand strategy. They didn't understand me. I remembered all the nights I had stayed awake. All the meals I had skipped. All the opportunities one had passed. And I felt nothing. Not regret. Not resentment. Just distance. Because distance gives perspective. And perspective gives power. I was no longer inside the situation. I was above it. Watching. Calculating. Waiting. They were playing checkers. I was done playing games. They thought they were moving me out. They didn't realize they were moving themselves into a corner. And corners are dangerous places to stand. They started rushing. You can always tell when people feel time slipping. Movements get sharper. Voices get shorter. Decisions get careless. They were no longer hiding well. One of them moved a box from the hallway and didn't put it back. Another left papers on the table. A third forgot to close a door. Small things. But small things reveal big truths. They were nervous. And nervous people make mistakes. I watched them argue over something trivial. A lamp. A chair. A shelf. It wasn't about the item. It was about control. People fight when they feel power shifting. And power was shifting. They just didn't know which direction. One morning, they told me I needed to meet someone. A friend. Someone who could help. They said it casually. Too casually. I agreed. Because refusal would have raised questions. The meeting was awkward. Polite smiles. Shallow words. The person looked at me like a problem to be solved. That told me everything. This was not help. This was placement. They were trying to place me. Like furniture. Like responsibility. Like inconvenience. I thanked them. They smiled. But their eyes searched my face. Looking for weakness. I gave them none. They looked disappointed. That made me curious. After the person left, they talked in low voices. Quick tones. Frustrated. I stayed in the kitchen. Invisible. listening. One of them said something sharp. Another replied with tension. A third cut in. Then silence. They noticed me. Smiled. I smiled back. Because people who are nervous always smile too much. They asked if I liked the person. I said they seemed fine. They relaxed. People always relax when you agree. Agreement is a disguise. They didn't see mine. That night, I checked the files again. Everything. Top to bottom. Not because I was unsure. Because I wanted to be precise. Precision is quiet. And deadly. I lined up dates. Names. Signatures. I matched timelines. And the picture became clear. They had not just changed things. They had hidden things. They had assumed I would never look. They had assumed I was too busy. They had assumed I was too loyal. They had assumed wrong. I sat there in the dim light and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control. Not over them. Over myself. And that is always the first step. The next day, they came in together. All of them. That alone was unusual. People only gather when something is wrong or something is ending. They sat me down. Not asked. Sat me down. They spoke carefully. Rehearsed. Soft voices. Kind words. They said it was time. They said they had found a place. They said it would be good for me. They said everything except the truth. The truth was simple. They wanted me gone. I nodded. They smiled. Relief passed through the room like air. They thought it was done. They thought I had accepted. They thought they were in control. I let them think that, because people who think they have won stop paying attention. And attention is the only defense. They asked when I would be ready. I said soon. They relaxed more. Too much. That is always a mistake. One of them stood up and started talking about renovations. Already. As if I wasn't sitting there. That told me everything I needed to know. I excused myself and went to my room. Not angry. Focused. Because now, the timeline was clear. They were moving. And so was I. But in a different direction. That evening, I made a call. Not to them. To someone they didn't expect. I spoke calmly. Carefully. Precisely. I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. I just asked the right questions. And the answers were exactly what I thought. I thanked them and ended the call. My hands were steady. My voice was calm. Because preparation kills fear. They came in later that night. Loud. Laughing. Relaxed. They were celebrating. Not openly. But you can feel it when people think they've won. They talked about plans. About trips. About changes. I listened. And I noted. Because people reveal priorities when they think no one is judging. They didn't know they were being judged. Not emotionally. Strategically. One of them said something careless. A joke. A line. The others laughed. I didn't. They noticed. Then pretended not to. But their eyes flicked toward me. Concern. Good. Concern means awareness. Awareness means fear. Fear means pressure. And pressure makes cracks. They started moving faster after that. Pushing dates. Changing schedules. Making calls. They were trying to close something. Before something else opened. They didn't know I was already holding the door. I packed another box. Slowly. Where they could see. They smiled. I smiled. Two people smiling for very different reasons. They told me movers were coming soon. I said okay. They relaxed. Again. They never learned. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. Not thinking about loss. Not thinking about pain. Thinking about timing. When. Not if. When. Because revenge is not an emotion. It is a decision. And I had already made mine. They thought they were pushing me out. They didn't realize they were walking in. And once you walk into something you don't understand, there is no easy way out. I slept well that night, because I knew something they didn't. And knowledge is a quiet comfort. They stopped hiding their impatience. Not because they were brave, because they were desperate. Desperation always looks like confidence to the untrained eye. I saw it for what it was. They began giving instructions instead of suggestions, telling instead of asking, deciding instead of discussing. I became a problem to manage, and they were not subtle about it. One of them told me I should pack faster. That time was important, that things were moving. I nodded, because pressure reveals intent, and their intent was clear. They were done pretending. They talked over me now, not around me, over me, as if I wasn't there. They made plans in front of me, dates, times, deliveries. They spoke of me like I was luggage, something to move, something to store, something to forget. And still, I said nothing. Because silence unsettles people. They don't know what you are thinking, and not knowing makes them uneasy. They started watching me, not openly, out of the corner of their eye, waiting for something. Weakness, anger, breakdown. They didn't get it, because I was not breaking. I was observing. One afternoon, one of them snapped. A small thing. A cup left in the wrong place. A towel folded wrong. They raised their voice. Not loud, sharp, controlled. That kind of anger that feels practiced. I looked at them calmly. Not apologizing. Not arguing. Just looking. They stopped, cleared their throat, mumbled something, and walked away. People who feel powerful don't explain themselves. They had just explained everything. They were not in control. They were pretending. And pretending is exhausting. I heard another argument later. Behind a closed door. My name mentioned again. More sharply this time. I didn't move. I let them think I hadn't heard. Because I wanted them careless. And they were. They said things. Ugly things. Not about what I did. About who I was. That told me everything. When people can't attack your actions, they attack your existence. They were trying to justify what they were doing. To themselves. Not to me. That is always the final stage before cruelty. They came out of the room smiling. Too wide. Too fake. They asked if I needed anything. I said no. They nodded. Relieved. Because they want the victim cooperative. It makes them feel less guilty. They started inviting people again. Strangers. Friends. Advisors. The house filled with voices that had no history there. They talked about change. About improvement. About value. They never talked about care. They never talked about sacrifice. They never talked about the years. Because those things make people uncomfortable. And discomfort challenges entitlement. I stood by the window and watched cars come and go. I listened to laughter that didn't belong. I heard plans that didn't include me. And I felt nothing. Not because I was empty. Because I was focused. They didn't understand that every insult, every dismissal, every cold look was making my position stronger. Because they were building motive. And motive is powerful. One of them told me I couldn't use a certain room anymore. Said it casually. Like it was no big deal. I nodded. And moved my things. Because resistance would have slowed them. And I wanted them fast. Fast people make mistakes. They started locking doors. Not because of safety. Because of control. I noticed. I said nothing. One night, they didn't even wait for me to leave the room before talking. They spoke as if I wasn't there. About me. In front of me. That is not disrespect. That is erasure. They were erasing me. I let them. Because erased people are invisible. And invisible people move freely. They asked me to sign something. Not important, they said. Routine, they said. I read it. They watched me. I took my time. They shifted. I signed. Not because I agreed. Because I wanted them confident. Confidence blinds. They were pushing. Harder now. Faster. They wanted closure. They wanted the end. They didn't know the end was not where they thought it was. They started setting dates. Talking about keys. Talking about handover. They smiled when they said it. Like they were proud. Proud of what? Of removing the one person who stayed? Of discarding the one who carried? Of eliminating the inconvenience of loyalty? They didn't see it that way. People never do. They see only what benefits them. I watched them take photos of rooms, measure walls, discuss colors. They were redesigning my life. Without me. And I let them. Because while they were focused on the house, I was focused on the truth. And truth is heavier than walls. I could feel it coming. The shift. The moment. The crack. They were tense. They were tired. They were careless. And carelessness is opportunity. One evening, one of them said something they shouldn't have. Not loudly. Not intentionally. But clearly. They mentioned something that connected everything. Something that proved what I already knew. They froze. I looked at them. Calmly. They looked away. Too late. That was it. That was the confirmation. They had done something. And they were afraid I knew. I didn't react. I didn't smile. I didn't change. I just continued. And that unsettled them more than any anger could. Because anger is expected. Silence is not. They started making mistakes after that. Forgetting things. Contradicting themselves. Losing track of their own story. Lies always collapse under pressure. And pressure was now constant. They asked me again if I had spoken to anyone. I said no. They stared. Longer this time. I met their eyes. Unblinking. They looked away. People who look away first are hiding. And they were hiding a lot. I was no longer guessing. I was waiting. Because when people are cornered, they reveal everything. And they were very close to the corner. They stopped trying to be kind. Not because they didn't know how. Because they didn't see the need anymore. Once people believe you are powerless, politeness becomes optional. They walked past me without acknowledging. They spoke to each other as if I was air. They made decisions that affected me without mentioning my name. I was no longer a person. I was a problem. And problems are handled. One of them moved my belongings from a common area without asking. Just picked them up and placed them elsewhere. I watched. Did nothing. Because reaction would have given them power. They wanted reaction. They didn't get it. They began to correct me in front of others. Small things. Trivial things. But in front of people. That is not about order. That is about dominance. I nodded. Because dominance needs resistance to exist. Without resistance, it looks weak. They grew bolder. They told me where to sit, where not to sit, when to eat. As if I was a guest. As if I had not built the routine they now controlled. I followed. Not because I agreed. Because I was waiting. They brought someone again. Another helper. Another option. They spoke about me in the third person. Right in front of me. As if I wasn't there. That is not ignorance. That is intention. They wanted me small. They wanted me quiet. They wanted me gone. I gave them what they wanted. Or so they thought. Inside, I was recording everything. Tone. Words. Glances. Timing. Because behavior tells stories. And their story was ugly. They began locking things. Cabinets. Drawers. Doors. Control always escalates. It never stays where it starts. They were tightening their grip, because they were afraid of losing. I noticed one of them checking their phone constantly. Messages, calls, updates. They were waiting for something, or someone. That meant something was in motion. And when something is in motion, it can be redirected. They spoke about money more. Not directly, but often. Complaints, worries, calculations. They were under pressure. And pressure reveals character. Their character was not impressive. One afternoon, one of them raised their voice at me. Not shouted, but firm, sharp, in front of someone else. They corrected me, as if I was a child, as if I was careless. I looked at them calmly, not defensive, not ashamed, just calm. They paused, because they expected submission. They got stillness. Stillness unsettles people, because it makes them question. They walked away. I could feel their frustration. Good. Frustration makes people reckless. They started blaming me for things. Small things. Missing things. Misplaced things. I had not touched anything. But that didn't matter. Blame is a tool. They were trying to build a case. To justify. To excuse. To explain. To themselves. Not to me. I understood then. They weren't just removing me. They were rewriting me. They were changing the story. From caregiver to burden. From support to obstacle. From loyal to inconvenient. That is how people sleep at night. By changing the narrative. I let them. Because false stories collapse. Truth doesn't. They began excluding me from conversations completely. Stopping when I entered. Lowering voices. Then not caring if I heard. They were done hiding. That told me they were near the end. People only stop hiding when they believe the outcome is certain. Certainty makes people careless. They began to argue more. Louder. More often. Not with me. With each other. Pressure was cracking them. And cracks are useful. I listened. They blamed each other. Accused. Deflected. Defended. They were not united. And divided people lose. They mentioned dates again. Deadlines. Urgency. They were in a rush. Something was chasing them. I already knew what. They just didn't know I knew. One evening, they told me movers were confirmed. Not asked. Confirmed. They told me where I would be going. Not asked. Told. They smiled while saying it. As if it was kindness. As if it was a gift. As if it was mercy. I thanked them. They relaxed. Again. They always relaxed when I agreed. They thought agreement meant surrender. They didn't understand that agreement was camouflage. I packed another box. Slowly. Neatly. Where they could see. They smiled. I smiled. Two people pretending. One with a plan. One without. They started giving me instructions about what to take. What to leave. What was not mine. That is always interesting. When people decide ownership without understanding history. I nodded. Because arguing would have slowed them. And I wanted speed. Speed reveals mistakes. They began to boast. Small comments. Jokes. About finally having space. Finally having freedom. Freedom from what? From me. From responsibility. From guilt. They laughed. I didn't. They noticed. Then pretended not to. Their comfort was growing. And comfort is dangerous. I heard one of them mention something that didn't add up. A detail that contradicted an earlier statement. I filed it away. Because lies don't like consistency. They slipped again the next day. Another small contradiction. Another mismatch. They didn't notice. But I did. I always did. Because I was not emotional. I was focused. They were underestimating me. That is always fatal. They started treating me like I was already gone. Not offering food. Not asking. Not including. I made my own. Quietly. Because independence unsettles control. They wanted me dependent. I wasn't. They wanted me grateful. I wasn't. They wanted me weak. I wasn't. I was patient. And patience is stronger than anger. They didn't know that. They thought patience meant defeat. They would learn. They crossed it without noticing. That's how it always happens. People don't wake up cruel. They become cruel by steps. And they had taken enough steps. One of them went into my room without asking. Moved things. Touched things. Sorted things. I came back and saw it immediately. The order was wrong. They had never noticed order. That was my work. I said nothing. Because anger would have told them they mattered. They didn't. They began to limit what I could use. The kitchen. The living room. Certain spaces. Not officially. Informally. Comments. Looks. Suggestions. Control dressed as concern. I adjusted. Because resistance feeds control. Compliance starves it. They didn't understand that. They thought I was shrinking. I was narrowing. And narrow focus is dangerous. They started discussing money in front of me. Amounts. Shares. Who gets what? They spoke freely. As if I wasn't there. As if I was already gone. One of them laughed. I remember that. Not because it hurt. Because it revealed. They were enjoying it. Enjoying the removal. Enjoying the power. Enjoying the control. That told me something important. This was not necessity. This was choice. And choice carries responsibility. They asked me to move a box. A heavy one. I did. Without comment. They watched. They always watched. Looking for weakness. Looking for fatigue. Looking for collapse. They didn't get it. They got calm. And calm makes cruel people uncomfortable. Because they want reaction. They want tears. They want anger. They want proof. I gave them nothing. They started making jokes about me. Small ones. Sharp ones. Disguised as humor. In front of others. Testing. Seeing how far they could go. I smiled. Not because it was funny. Because it confused them. Confusion is powerful. It disrupts expectation. They didn't know how to respond. They laughed too loudly. Then stopped. Awkward. People don't like when their cruelty doesn't land. It makes them question. They didn't want to question. They wanted control. So they tried harder. They told me I was slow. That I was in the way. That I was taking too long. They said it lightly. But lightly can still cut. I nodded. Because I was timing them. And they were on schedule. They began to talk about me as if I wasn't capable. As if I wasn't aware. As if I wasn't intelligent. They underestimated. That is always a gift. I listened. Because underestimation makes people careless. And carelessness reveals everything. One evening, one of them made a decision without telling me. A big one. About my things. I found out after. Not from them. From the result. They had moved something important. Disposed of something meaningful. Without asking. Without telling. Without caring. That was not oversight. That was erasure. They were erasing me. On purpose. I stood in the doorway and looked at the empty space. And I felt something shift. Not anger. Not sadness. Finality. Because once someone erases you, they cannot pretend they respect you. And respect, once gone, never returns. I went to the kitchen. Made tea. Saturday. They watched me. Waiting. For reaction. For explosion. For breakdown. They got nothing. and that unsettled them more than anything else. Because cruelty expects response. When it doesn't get it, it feels weak. They grew irritated. One of them snapped at me. Not about anything important. Just to assert. Just to dominate. I looked at them. Come. Steady. Not afraid. They faltered. People who rely on power fear resistance. And calm is resistance. They walked away. Frustrated. I could feel the shift. They were losing patience. And patience is the last mask. Once patience is gone, the truth comes out. They stopped pretending it was about my good. They started saying what they meant. That it was time. That they needed space. That things had to change. That I had to go. No softness. No excuses. Just command. I nodded. Because commands are interesting. They reveal how someone sees you. And they saw me as beneath. That was clear. I thanked them. They looked confused. Because gratitude was not expected. They wanted submission. They got acceptance. Acceptance unsettles people. Because it gives them no power. They were uncomfortable. I could see it. In the way they shifted. In the way they avoided my eyes. They knew they were wrong. But they were committed. And committed people go all the way. They began to pack my things for me. Not carefully. Not respectfully. Just quickly. As if I was already gone. I watched. Did nothing. Because intervention would have slowed them. And I wanted speed. Speed exposes. They made mistakes. Left things behind. Mixed things up. Dropped things. They were sloppy. And sloppiness is evidence. They talked about the movers again. Dates. Times. Finality. They smiled. Relieved. They thought the problem was almost solved. They thought I was almost gone. They didn't know the problem was about to begin. One of them said something cruel. Not joking. Not disguised. Direct. They said it without emotion. Without hesitation. Without care. That was the moment. Not the first. But the last. The line had been crossed. And lines, once crossed, do not uncross. I looked at them. Not angry. Not shocked. Just clear. They paused. They felt it. The shift. Even if they didn't understand it. They felt something change. Because people can sense when someone is done. Truly done. Not tired. Not hurt. Done. They looked away. And I knew. It was time. Not to react. To act. Quietly. Precisely. Completely. Because when someone shows you who they are, the correct response is not to argue. It is to adjust. And I had adjusted. They went to bed that night confident. Relieved. Certain. I went to bed calm. Prepared. Certain. Two very different kinds of certainty. Only one of us was right. They slept well that night. I could hear it in the house. The deep quiet. The relaxed air. The careless calm. People sleep well when they think problems are solved. I didn't sleep much. Not because I was worried. Because I was working. Not with hands. With mind. Revenge is not movement. It is placement. I waited until the house settled. Until doors were closed. Until voices faded. Until certainty filled their rooms. Then I moved. Not quickly. Not loudly. Carefully. I went to the files. Not all of them. Only the ones that mattered. I took what I needed. And I left what I didn't. Because chaos attracts attention. Precision does not. I read again. Slowly. Calmly. Confirming. Everything matched. Everything aligned. They had been careless. Not because they were stupid. Because they were comfortable. Comfort creates blindness. I made notes. Not on paper. In my head. Because paper can be found. Thought cannot. I placed everything back exactly where it was. Order is important. Disorder is suspicious. I returned to my room and sat on the bed. And for the first time, I smiled. Not wide. Not visible. Inside. Because now, I wasn't reacting. I was directing. The next morning, they were loud, happy, busy, talking about schedules, about plans, about the movers, about the end. They didn't notice me watching. They didn't notice the calm. They didn't notice the shift. Because they weren't looking. People never look at what they believe is finished. They asked if I was ready. I said soon. They nodded. Satisfied. They didn't ask what that meant. They assumed. Assumption is lazy. And lazy thinking costs. They left the house together. All of them. That was rare. And useful. The house became quiet. Not empty. Clear. I made a call. Not emotional. Not angry. Professional. I asked specific questions. I gave specific details. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. The person on the other end paused. Then asked more. I answered. Calmly. Accurately. I heard the shift in their tone. From polite to alert. That told me everything. They hadn't known. They would soon. I thanked them. And ended the call. My hands were steady. Because when you know the truth, you don't shake. I made another call. Different person. Different purpose. Same calm. Same precision. They asked if I was sure. I said yes. They said they would look into it. I said thank you. And that was that. No drama. No threats. No warnings. Just movement. Quiet movement. The best kind. They came back later, loud again. Laughing. Carrying bags. Talking about lunch. They were relaxed. They were celebrating. I watched. And I thought about how dangerous celebration is when it is premature. They spoke about timelines again. Dates. Deadlines. I nodded. They smiled. They thought I was cooperating. They didn't realize I was scheduling. They brought out a document. Placed it in front of me. Asked me to sign. I looked at it. Slowly. Carefully. They shifted. They were nervous. I could feel it. I smiled. Lightly. And signed. They relaxed. That was a mistake. They didn't know what I knew. They didn't know what was already in motion. They thought the paper was power. Paper is only power when the truth is hidden. And their truth was no longer hidden. They started talking about money again. Joking. Planning. They were already spending. That always comes before loss. I excused myself. Went to my room. And waited. Because sometimes, the best action is no action. Let people walk. Let people step. Let people fall. Time passed. Hours. Quiet. Then the phone rang. Not mine. Theirs. One of them answered. I heard the shift. The pause. The tone change. The silence. They said, okay. Quietly. Too quietly. They hung up. Looked around. Said nothing. But their face was different. Not relaxed. Not confident. Tight. Controlled. Alert. They looked at me. I looked back. They looked away. Something had started. They didn't know what. But they felt it. The house changed. The air changed. People feel when control slips. Even if they don't know why. They started whispering. Quick conversations. Short sentences. They checked phones. Sent messages. Waited. They were no longer celebrating. They were calculating. Good. Calculation means fear. Fear means exposure. Exposure means opportunity. They asked me if everything was okay. I said yes. They nodded. But they didn't believe me. And for the first time, that mattered. Because now, I wanted them to worry. They asked if I had talked to anyone. I said no. They didn't relax. That told me the calls had already reached them. Good. They were beginning to understand that something was wrong. They just didn't know what. And not knowing is worse than knowing. They were quiet that night. Too quiet. They avoided me. Too carefully.